Throughout history, there have always been those who emerge out of relative obscurity to take center stage, at least for a while. Within the halls of academe, Robert Maynard Hutchins was such a person. For several decades prior to the ascendancy of Hutchins, the leading philosopher of education in the United States was John Dewey. This is their stories. My name is Edward J. Dodson. I have taught political economy for 40 years. Both John Dewey and Robert M. Hutchins have influenced how and what I teach to students in the classroom. Hutchins has been the subject of several biographies, the most comprehensive of which is by his longtime associate, Harry Ashmore. A second book I would recommend is the memoir by Milton Mayer, which appeared in 1993. Robert Maynard Hutchins was born in the last year of the 19th century into a Presbyterian family, the head of which served as pastor of the neighborhood church in the Bedford section of Brooklyn, New York. Years later, Hutchins recalled of his childhood, "I was born in the dying century, before the open gas flame was superseded by the Welsbach burner, before the horse cars had disappeared, before the telephone was commonplace, and when the Iceman was one of the mainstays of our lives. Although everybody went to school, almost nobody went to college, but everybody went to church." When the United States entered the First World War, 18-year-old Robert M. Hutchins left Oberlin College to enter the U.S. Army Ambulance Corps, living up to his obligation as a citizen and patriot, as well as his moral aversion to the possibility of taking the life of another person. Stationed in Italy, he did his job, removing injured soldiers from the front, at times under heavy artillery fire by Austrians. Recovering in hospital from an illness, he came to form a rather negative opinion of Italian allies. He wrote, "They filled up our half-empty ward with Italians in the recovering stage. Individually, the Italians are the people I shall avoid most after the war. You have to admire their collective bravery when things are going their way. But as persons they are rotten, that's all. They have no sense of decency, and they will steal your gold teeth in your sleep." John Dewey supported entry of the United States into the war as a moral crusade against the romantic nationalism embodied in the German people and state. He believed that what was needed to make this clear to other Americans was a truly national and compulsory educational system, education that would counteract the provincialism and isolation of life across the country. Following the terms of peace dictated to the Germans at Versailles, Dewey joined with others, such as the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who expressed their belief that the war and all the accompanying death and destruction had solved nothing. And in fact, the war had destroyed all momentum toward the domestic progressive reforms Dewey embraced. In a lecture Dewey delivered in 1918, he conveyed his loss of optimism. "War and the existing economic regime are so fraught with evil consequences that anyone who is so disposed can heap up criticisms without end." Back from the war, Robert Hutchins enrolled at Yale University in 1919, where he thrived, earning needed money by establishing a cooperative tutoring service for students who sought academic help. However, for him, the great value of attending Yale was the contacts he made with men destined to become prominent in some capacity. He said, "We went to Yale to become Yale men. Yale men could pass through portals and scale heights which others could not attain. They could do so not because of what they knew, but simply because of where they had been. The benefits flowing to me from my acquisition of this title have been considerable, and I do not underrate them. My point is that these benefits had nothing to do with my intellectual development. After his junior year, Hutchins enrolled in the law school, out of boredom more than any desire for a career in the law. Yet it was here, he later said, his real education began. I do not mean to say that I knew then I was getting an education. I am sure the professors did not know they were giving me one. They would have been shocked at such an insinuation. They thought they were teaching me law. They did not teach me any law, but they did something far more important. They introduced me to the liberal arts. Still in his junior year, he met and soon was engaged to marry the 19-year-old Maud Phepps McVie. They married in September of 1921. Already he was forming the ideas that would dominate his thinking for decades to come. Selected to deliver the class oration, he entitled his talk, "Should Institutions of Learning Be Abolished?" What had he learned from being a student at Yale? If at college we have never tasted what may be called the sweetness and glory of being rational animals, it is because America does not know or highly esteem that sweetness and that glory. Where shall our country find its leaders if not among that 2% of her population who have been favored by 4 years of college? The back-and-forth struggle between Robert Hutchins and John Dewey for the hearts and minds of educators was about to begin. Dewey's early life was certainly quite different from that of Hutchins. John Dewey was born in 1859 in Burlington, Vermont, and eventually graduated from the University of Vermont, after which he taught high school for several years before enrolling at Johns Hopkins University. One of the professors at the University of Vermont that Dewey admired greatly was Matthew Buckham, who taught political and social philosophy. Professor Buckham taught using the Socratic method, encouraging students to ask questions, offer their opinions, but be prepared to defend them. Yet Buckham was a social conservative with little patience for social reformers. Dewey was one of those students who posed questions difficult to answer. At Johns Hopkins, John Dewey added history and political science to his study of philosophy. He was already developing a deep concern over social problems, yet he was rather disappointed by the absence of analysis taken by his professors. In a letter to W.T. Harris, editor of the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, he wrote, "I am taking as a minor subject the theory of state, international law, etc., in the historical department, and am in pretty close contact with the men there. It was the largest and in the character of its students about the strongest department in the university, but there is no provision to give them the philosophical side of their own subjects. The philosophy of history and of social ethics in its widest sense is untouched, and as long as it remains so, they don't get more than half the good of their own courses, it seems to me." However, what captured Dewey's interest most were courses he took under George Morris, a visiting professor of philosophy from the University of Michigan. Morris's neo-Hegelianism solved problems Dewey grappled with concerning the validity of sensations or feelings as a source of knowledge, given that our sensations are essentially relative to us as individuals. Knowledge also came from our contemplative and analytical powers. After receiving his doctorate degree from the School of Arts and Sciences, he joined the faculty at the University of Michigan under George Morris, where he remained until 1888, when he was appointed professor of mental and moral philosophy at the University of Minnesota. It was during his time at Michigan that he became interested in the education of the young and in the function of society as a social organism. In his 1888 essay, The Ethics of Democracy, Dewey explains that democracy is much more than the nature of institutions and procedures. In conception, at least, democracy approaches most nearly the ideal of all social organizations, that in which the individual and society are organic to each other. For this reason, democracy, so far as it is really democracy, is the most stable, not the most insecure of governments. Full democracy, Dewey argues, requires that all individual relations are to be regarded as subordinate to human relations. The proper function of government was to anticipate and prevent the victimization of some members of society by others. He supported laws that held business and industry to ethical standards of behavior, and also supported the right of workers to organize into trade unions. In 1894, Dewey left Michigan to join the faculty at the University of Minnesota. However, following the death of his mentor, George Morris, Dewey was brought back to Michigan to head the philosophy department. He soon renewed his work on teaching and learning methods, addressing teaching organizations on topics such as attention, memory, imagination, and thinking. Intellectually, he was now moving away from the neo-Hegelianism of Morris. Influenced by evolutionary biology, he became increasingly interested in how we engage with and adapt to our changing environment. He now immersed himself in the writings of William James and George Herbert Mead, leading figures in pragmatist philosophy. Of the many insights provided by William James, this quote is oft repeated. There is nothing so absurd that it cannot be believed as truth if repeated often enough. Biographer George Dicousin succinctly describes how far Dewey had come. Dewey tied his pragmatism and idealism together by asserting that the only way the individual can acquire knowledge of reality or truth is through action and experiment. Dewey called his point of view experimental idealism, which accurately states his position. In 1894, Dewey left the University of Michigan to join the faculty of the newly established University of Chicago. One of his first appointments was George Herbert Mead. This photo is of the university's philosophical club, Dewey serving as club president during 1895 and 1896. Asked to build a new department to evaluate methods and practice of teaching, that is, of pedagogy, Dewey initiated the University of Chicago laboratory schools, where he put his new educational philosophy to work. In 1899, his conclusions were published in the book, The School and Society. Educators everywhere began to pay attention to what was happening at Chicago. Over the next 6 years, Dewey organized teacher roundtables, brought in prominent educators to speak, and published a growing list of papers on education pedagogy. In 1901, the university changed the name to the Department of Education, incorporating into its program the Experimental Chicago Institute, endowed in 1899 with a $1 million grant by the daughter of Cyrus McCormick. Here is an early photograph of the new school, named after Francis W. Parker, founder of the Chicago Institute. Dewey took over after Parker died in 1902 and turned the university's program in education into what was generally considered to be the most comprehensive in the United States. His approach was to stress group activities that challenged their abilities for problem solving. An important outcome, he believed, was the development of attitudes necessary for life in a democratic society. In The School and Society, he explained this connection with basic skill development. We must conceive of work in wood and metal, of weaving, sewing, and cooking, as methods of living and learning, not as distinct studies. We must conceive of them in their social significance, as types of the processes by which society keeps itself going, as agencies for bringing home to the child some of the primal necessities of community life, and as ways in which these needs have been met by the growing insight and ingenuity of man. In short, as instrumentalities through which the school itself shall be made a genuine form of active community life, instead of a place set apart in which to learn lessons. Chicago was at the time a strong center of activist support for the ideas of Henry George, and John Dewey met a number of the leading single taxers at Jane Addams' Hull House and other public meetings. Dewey had read George's Progress in Poverty, later describing him as one of the world's great social philosophers, certainly the greatest which this country has produced. It did not take long for Dewey's efforts to restructure elementary school education to provoke resistance. His approach was neither inclusive nor collaborative, not with parents, teachers, or existing administrators. Also, he had put forward the name of his wife to become principal of the new elementary school. Dewey decided his usefulness at the University of Chicago had ended. He submitted his letter of resignation on the 6th of April, 1904. He then reached out to a former Johns Hopkins colleague now at Columbia University, and funds were raised to bring him there. The place at Columbia where Dewey's education theories would have the most important impact was the Teachers College, arguably the home of liberal educational thought in the United States. His most influential writing during this period was a book written for teachers titled How We Think. In this work, he explained that because the learning process is the thinking process, children must be taught to think, and think as a scientist thinks. As Dewey observed, the native and unspoiled attitude of childhood, marked by ardent curiosity, fertile imagination, and love of experimental inquiry, is near, very near, to the attitude of the scientific mind. What Robert M. Hutchins would find so damaging now began to take hold: the growth in vocational and industrial education at the expense of the study of the great ideas, the great works of Western civilization. Dewey explained what, in his view, was at stake. No question at present under discussion in education is so fraught with consequences for the future of democracy as the question of industrial education. Its right development will do more to make public education truly democratic than any other one agency now under consideration. Its wrong treatment will as surely accentuate all undemocratic tendencies in our present situation by fostering and strengthening class divisions in school and out. In 1916, Dewey produced what is considered his seminal work on progressive education, Democracy and Education. In this and earlier writings, Dewey argued that education and learning are social and interactive processes. Schools are therefore social institutions serving as laboratories for social reform. Students should actively participate in their educational experience rather than passively listen to lectures, complete assigned readings, write papers, and take examinations. He saw social development of the young person as an essential function of education. The need of training is too evident. The pressure to accomplish a change in their attitude and habits is too urgent to leave these consequences wholly out of account. Since our chief business with them is to enable them to share in a common life, we cannot help considering whether or not we are forming the powers which will secure this ability. When Robert M. Hutchins began his own career in education, he acknowledged that education in the land of his birth had been of the practical and useful sort going back to the colonial period of self-reliance, with the establishment of societies for the diffusion of useful knowledge as championed by Benjamin Franklin. However, fulfilling the human potential demanded other knowledge as well, as evidenced by the studies undertaken by the leading figures of the age of Franklin. Already married, Hutchins left law school and found employment teaching English and history at a private college preparatory school in upstate New York. What he did there, he concluded, had little, if anything, to do with education. In the school I taught in, I did not dare try to educate my charges. It would have confused their minds. Not long thereafter, he received an offer from Yale University to become secretary of the corporation, responsible for public relations and fundraising. The person responsible for bringing Hutchins to Yale, President James Angell, had been in the psychology department faculty under John Dewey. He began work at Yale on the 1st of January, 1923. Hutchins now renewed his pursuit of a degree in the law, balancing work responsibilities that included extensive travel to speak to alumni groups with his studies and classroom attendance. Working for the university did not prevent him from expressing dissatisfaction with the type of education undergraduate students received, as this brief excerpt from a talk given to prep school students reveals. Those who grow apprehensive about atheism and Bolshevism in the colleges merely betray their ignorance, for the most conservative places in America today, as faculty members know, are the universities. What he found attractive in his study of the law was the Socratic method of instruction. What he rebelled against was the law as a trade and the emphasis on technical knowledge, drawing up of wills, writing contracts, or the methods of examining witnesses at trial. Hutchins received his law degree in 1925 and became a member of the Yale Law School faculty, assigned to teach criminal law in a manner with which he found little merit. It seemed to me that the only way you could sensibly go after criminal law was to go into the whole system, to go into criminology, go into corrections, and for these purposes try to draw on what I assumed to be the vast knowledge of psychologists and psychiatrists, who were then a budding profession in this country. And anybody else who could shed light on what the actual role of the criminal law was, and how it could be made to work to reduce crime and to do justice rather than to increase crime and increase injustice. We've reached the end of part 1.